days with you. And to have my colleagues here in body is kind of feels like a miracle right now. And to have all of you listening with us is another miracle. So this is wonderful to be together in this assorted hybrid way. And we hope to hear from the Zoom audience. We hope to hear from you through the Q&A. And Elissa Hamlet, a postdoc who's helping run the conference, will come and announce your questions at the end when we won't probably get to all of them. And our live audience will ask questions at the podium. Okay, so I'm just going to give a brief overview. My name is Elissa Epel. I am the current president of ABMR for a few more days until I hand the gavel to my wonderful colleague, Anna Marsland. And we are focusing for the next few days on optimal longevity and geroscience. So it's always fun to kind of start with thinking about aging and all those negative stereotypes we have about aging. Well, it turns out what we think about aging actually matters, that our stereotypes create behaviors in reality, those attitudes. So here's one attitude. Don't complain about growing old. It's a privilege denied to many. So we forget that. It really is a privilege. It's a privilege to be here and to have our health and our bodies today. And with that, I just want to have a moment of silence for the members that we have lost over the last year or two, and also for the 700,000 who have died from COVID, as well as all of those we have lost globally. So if we can all just have a moment of silence together. It's a privilege to talk about aging. Another attitude I love, noticing how paradoxical it is. The idea of living a long life appeals to everyone, but the idea of getting old doesn't appeal to anyone. So that brings us to really health span, living well longer, feeling well in our body, compressing the disease span toward the end of life. So I'm going to briefly just go over what is geroscience. It's a new field, interdisciplinary field in aging that has a big umbrella. And as behavioral scientists, we not only fit under this umbrella, but we are essential players. The idea of geroscience is that we focus on, rather than on treating disease later in life and trying to reverse and cure diseases that are mostly uncurable, we focus earlier in life on prevention. We understand and measure the biology of aging. And then we develop drugs to treat aging. Boy, that would be amazing. There's also other drivers of aging besides genetics and biology. The biggest drivers of aging are behavioral, social, and I'll add moral. And that's where we come in as important players in the field of geroscience. And I'll lastly mention intergenerational and ecological drivers. So the biology of aging is absolutely fascinating. And we are going to hear the best minds, the best research on the different ways we can look into the body and measure biological aging at different levels, cellular to functional. So this is a model I'm showing you, the hallmarks of aging, it's been called. And I added the word biological just to remember how narrow this view is. But these hallmarks of aging, these different models of aging are very important. They are targets of slowing aging. So we have epigenetics, telomeres, cellular nutrient sensing, mitochondria. We'll get to hear about mitochondria soon from Martin Picard. Epigenetic aging, we'll hear from Steve Horvath, as well as Dan Belsky, pioneers in understanding the epigenetics of aging. And we'll understand what the drivers are of accelerated aging. And the idea behind that is, rather than trying to focus on therapeutics for all of the range of diseases of aging, if we can target the biology of aging and slow it, we can reduce and compress the amount of diseases of aging we get early in life and compress that toward the end. So how's that going for us? That focus on biological aging. I will say it's a very exciting time. We are really learning a tremendous amount about the cellular biological aging mechanisms. And we'll hear from Terry Moffat also how to measure aging in a lot of more systemic ways across levels of analysis, all the way to function. So where are we at with aging drugs? We all want a pill. I want a pill. I'm praying that they will develop therapeutics for anti-aging. And guess what? What is on the table? We do not have a drug of aging yet. And these are some very interesting possibilities: metformin, rapamycin, senolytics, drugs that kill senescent cells, very exciting ideas, as well as the NAD+ pathway. And so we hope that these develop into safe drugs that are available to people, and they do not increase the health disparities that we see, but rather reduce them. And they may or they may not. And even if we're successful with drugs of aging, will they really stop biological aging? The drivers of biological aging are ecological, social, and behavioral. So we may override them, like metformin. You can have diabetes and take metformin, but if you're still eating a toxic food diet, you're overriding the metformin. So the large drivers, again, are factors that we know how to change in our field, behavior change. I love this quote from my colleague, George Perry, who's a dean at UT, Texas. He's probably the most published author in dementia research on the biology and the therapeutics. We've had 350 trials on drugs to stop or reverse dementia. And what do we have? Zero therapeutics. It's complex. So when he heard about a conference, he said lifestyle approaches are the only demonstrated intervention that can reduce brain or increase our brain health span and reduce dementia. So I'm just pointing that out today. We're going to get to hear our colleagues soon talk about measuring and preventing dementia through non-pharmacological means. So I put the moonshot there because I think there's a lot of talk about going to the moon these days, and somehow that's mixed with this idea of living long, kind of use up the earth and then go exploit the moon. So I would just want us to think about rather than going to the moon, what is our moonshot? Here you see not the biological hallmarks of aging, but the social hallmarks of aging. This is by Eileen Crimmins, and she just simply pointed out there are 5 social hallmarks of aging that swamp anything we can measure so far today with biology and also predict biology. Low socioeconomic status, adverse life events, minority status, which we shouldn't call that anymore. It's really the global majority, people who are targeted for their skin color, et cetera. And then we have adverse psychological states, mental health and behaviors, lifestyle. And it's those that unite us here today, our deep knowledge in understanding behavior change and social change, the big levers of aging. So I have focused on stress, and I'll just briefly say that hormetic stress is an unexplored pathway for anti-aging. We know toxic stress accelerates aging, and here you can see if you have excess toxic stress, and including early life adversity, you might have a shorter health span. But the idea of increasing hormetic stress in our body to reverse and rejuvenate cells has really not been explored, except for in worms and in lower organisms. So what do I mean by hormetic stress? Well, we all know the idea of strengthening through adversity. What doesn't kill you can make you stronger. Well, here is a list at the top there of different acute stressors that we can do to our body that actually create positive salutary changes at the cellular level. So when we expose ourselves to, for example, cold and ice or hypothermia, that is actually creating cellular changes that we could consider anti-aging. We're going to hear about this from Ashley Mason this evening, the effect of hypothermia on the brain and mood and possibly health. Other things, exercise, we'll hear about that from Eli Putterman, particularly hormetic exercise, acute, intense, with a quick recovery. So stress, rejuvenance is something that is now kind of entering the map, this idea that part of aging is about poor stress resilience. And if we can measure stress resilience as a measure of aging and also increase stress resilience. Now, this next slide is a model by Alexandra Croswell. So one that we know well, which is that high stress creates an autonomic imbalance, high sympathetic to parasympathetic. And we think that when we relax and watch TV, we're reducing that. But in Alexandra's model, it's actually labeling and distinguishing between deep rest, deep restorative states that we don't get much of. And that those are actually the most restorative periods or critical periods in our body. We, of course, get that during deep sleep, and we're going to hear about sleep tomorrow night at dinner. And so in this model, it simply shows, these arousal states are important parts of thinking about aging. Those blue balls at the top are hormetic stressors. When they're short-term and acute, they might balance our autonomic nervous system. How do we increase deep rest? Meditation, being at retreats, those are obviously very privileged but very potent ways to increase our autonomic balance and improve that. We'll hear from Julian Thayer, one of the pioneers of understanding plasticity in the autonomic nervous system, very soon. This was a study that a group of us did, Eli Putterman, who's here, where we just measured the gene expression changes as well as the telomerase changes during a week at a retreat. Half the people meditated, half the people stayed at the resort and watched TV and stayed by the pool and relaxed. No one had computers or iPhones. At the end of the week, we found dramatic gene expression changes in both groups. So whether you go to the yoga and qigong here or not, you'll probably benefit from being here and eating this wonderful food and not having outside work. So what we did find was that almost a year later, 10 months later, we saw long-term effects, a maintenance of the improvements in mood in the group that had been trained, had trained their mind to focus their attention and to relax their body. That study was on mantra meditation. We don't need to argue about types of restorative activities because I personally don't think the body can tell the difference. This is a beautiful review by Julie Bauer and Mike Irwin showing that the range of mind-body interventions creates a common pathway of a reduction in pro-inflammatory signals, NF-kappa B, and its effectors. So we have amazing science to offer to the aging field. Inflammation is, of course, one of the hallmarks of aging. I want to just point out the intergenerational effects we're going to hear about as well tonight after dinner. We're going to hear how aging can start in the womb and early in life. There are many factors that the exposome, psychological, behavioral, and other exposures that impact health. And I believe that we have completely undervalued and have not realized the extent, the sensitivity of the critical period of pregnancy and maternal health for lifelong health. And it's been an important area. This is by a slide by our colleagues, Patik Wadwa, Sonia Entringer, Claudia Boos. The latter two couldn't be here because our borders are still closed, but they would have been at the talk tonight. They have a very sophisticated, beautiful model that they have been, I think, publishing remarkable papers showing the different ways that the exposome, and particularly psychological stress, can impact the developing fetus. And this next slide, you can see on day one of life, when the mother has been exposed to a lot of stress, the telomere length in the cord blood is shorter in the offspring. That's been shown by many labs now. This slide is showing you that positive affect is buffering, and maternal resilience during pregnancy is associated with longer telomere length. So there is no level playing field. Day one of life, there are influences from the germline, from the sperm, as well as the egg, as well as the maternal experience that are influencing lifelong health. At UCSF for about 10 years, a group of colleagues and I have been studying overweight pregnant women and looking at a model of we know that they're under high stress, can we actually intervene to impact their health and their offspring's health? And I'm just excited to run through some findings that I think are part of the future of the research on aging. Here you see this study, we called it Mamas, and Rob Lustig, who's here, Barbara Laraya, Nancy Adler, who couldn't be here. We developed an intervention, a two-month weekly intervention for pregnant women together. They were in a group where they learned the skill of well-being. They learned mindfulness, mindful eating, and they also had the group support. And what we found was in many ways that we looked at the offspring, we have found that this has had an impact on their well-being and their nervous system. And usually you don't get to look long-term, but Nikki Bush has had a subsequent grant to our Orbit intervention grant. So we've been able to follow them for 10 years. And you can see here that that stress was related to greater illness and doctor's visits in the first year, rapid infant growth by Jen Felder, who's here today, and sluggish autonomic reactivity. And more impressive, the intervention effects, we found that this short-term intervention improved the glucose tolerance on the oral glucose tolerance test of the pregnant mothers, improved the autonomic reactivity of the infants to a stressor, to the stranger test. We also found that mothers had dramatically lower stress and depression right after the intervention. That's not surprising, 8 weeks later. But what is surprising is Nikki Bush and Danielle Rubinov, who's also here, have followed them for 8 years, and their depressive symptoms remained low. And then they wanted to know, what about during COVID? These are all low-income women. The pandemic stressor might equal the playing field, wipe out the intervention effect. That last point there shows you that depression went up in all of our women, but still remained lower in the women who developed the well-being skills. Our interventions can be very powerful, particularly during vulnerable periods or critical periods. So I'm just so excited that we are learning how to measure biological aging so well in so many ways, and we're getting better at behavior change, the science, the refined science of behavior and social change. So I would just like to end with thinking about what is next for us as a field, as a very important player in geroscience. All of these drugs and all of these interventions are about a stable environment, happening in a stable climate. And we have lost our stable climate, and we will not have a stable climate for the rest of our lives. So I live in San Francisco, and many of us here woke up one day and it looked like we lived on Mars. We had smoke from fires. We had a heat wave, so we couldn't open our windows to get rid of the heat because we couldn't breathe. And it will happen every year. And it's only going to get worse. And that's just our little local climate. And I know you have your problems on your coast or where you live. And there's nowhere to run to. It's a global problem. I did try to run. I got sick, I got headaches, I got nauseous. I went to Colorado and the smoke came to Colorado. So you might think that the fundamental determinants of health now is a stable climate. But the fundamental cause of climate stress is actually something we've created as humans. It is the social inequity, it's our economic system of extraction that has just gone awry, and it's the systemic racism that's so inherent we can barely see it. And it's left us with existential stress. And so this is yet one more piece in our future of thinking about health and aging. A survey in Science showed that 10,000 youth across 10 different countries had climate distress. 68% of them were very anxious about climate. What is that doing to their bodies? You know, because you study the mind-body connection. Another paper that came out this month showed that our youth now will be exposed to 7 times more climate disasters. And most scientists agree that's an understatement. Allison Holman and Roxy Silver, who's watching, have been documenting the effects of disasters, natural disasters, on our health. And we'll hear about that during our climate session. And what's shocking about that is the long-term mental and physical health effects of disaster exposure for certain vulnerable people. So that is in our future. We need to keep that in mind. We can do our elegant, well-controlled studies and we need to connect it to what is happening in the environment. I love this quote by the author Arundhati Roy. In the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. What does that mean for us? What are you ready to fight for? How do we change our science and our work together to meet this challenge? So we talked about the social determinants of aging, and I'll just add the moral determinants of aging, which are also huge levers. This was a paper in JAMA by Don Berwick, which is quite interesting. And, activism isn't our business, but we also know that big determinants of health are the moral injuries and injustices and stratification that we live with. So for example, ratification of major human rights treaties is going to impact global health, making healthcare accessible, restoring leadership to reverse climate change, of course, and also reform of our criminal justice system. So all of these big factors are part of determinants of aging. So how do we have moral drivers of aging? How do we act on those? How do we study those? I just like to point to the compassion and mindfulness session that is actually changing minds and brain plasticity and has a potential to be connecting that, not just to health, but I think to applying, change in our social and policy world. So in summary, the future of aging research requires the integration of not just biological change and drugs, although we want those and need those, but also social and moral determinants of aging. And I just pointed out a few things that I think are interesting for us to keep in mind, which is interdependence, showing and demonstrating the interdependence that we know is there, even in a well-controlled study, measuring things like climate impacts. And there's so many ways to measure that. And I know Don Edmondson and others will talk about it in the climate panel. So it's a time to show the interdependence between our health span, our healthy aging, and the earth span, the healthy earth, and trying to stabilize our climate. I love the term metagenome, and I just can't forget it. So I just had to share it with you. We have studied genomics somewhat to death. We know how much they can predict, and it's limited. We know their importance well. And we think that we're just a result of our nuclear genome, but we are a metagenome. We are a host to a microbiome. So we have microbiota all over our skin that we share and we get imprinted on depending on where we live and the water we drink and the food we eat. We're going to see remarkable data on that from Michael Schneider tomorrow. So we are interacting, our metagenome is interacting. We also have mitochondria, we have epigenetics, and we have telomeres, malleable parts of our metagenome. And Martin Picard, who has shown for the first time, well-being, suffering, psychological stress is associated with health, the enzymes that our mitochondria make. So these are all just examples. There's these interactions that we can now measure and think of. And rather than think we're just this sole person, we're actually influencing our own body metagenome and each other's. So it's a very exciting time for interventions when we can measure aging better and we can change behavior better. It was exciting to hear about the work of the early stage investigators and all of the different behavior change models with our technology as well as our knowledge. And I just have fresh eyes, on what I've been doing. And I think that our discussions this weekend about how we can change what we're doing to be relevant for this portal that we have in front of us. So I'm involved in a study, for example, on a ketogenic diet. And I didn't love it at first because I'm a vegetarian, but I thought, cool, if we can help, people with diabetes. We're going to do a great study. And now I just find it absolutely intolerable. I think that even if these things work, so what? We cannot be so individualistic with our treatments and our interventions it's an extraction of the earth intervention as far as I'm concerned. I think reducing our intake of red meat is obviously one of the biggest personal levers we can push. So I'll just say that that's not going to be a next grant for me, continuing the ketogenic work. Reducing carbon burning, applying our behavioral medicine to that is, of course, a huge, open, exciting area that we can morph to together. I feel helpless as a single person, and I know you do too, when it comes to something like some of these moral determinants and social determinants. And I get hope from this model, so I wanted to share it with you, which is social quantum change by my colleague Karen O'Neill in Oslo. She used to be on the IPCC committee doing basic science on climate, and she has left that because she realizes that all of the policy changes and the technology changes in the middle of this model, the practical changes we need to reduce carbon are really, the levers for those are really the systems that we control with our mind and our culture. And so her book, that she's coming out with on social quantum change, the point of it is simply that, yes, you are just one person, but you are influential. You influence many people in your life, and that reminding yourself of that social influence is the way we're going to change things. Does anyone know who this I was going to say young man, but who this man is? Yes, this is Albert Bandura. I meant to drive him up to talk with you today. He was my first advisor. He's a founder of social learning theory, which is a basis of so much of our interventions. So the science of behavior change has grown, but it's really based on these fundamental ideas of self-efficacy, building self-efficacy, but more than that, building collective efficacy, that when we can have confidence that we can do something because we know we're part of a social group, that is one of the most powerful predictors of the future, of behavior, of change. I didn't bring him because he died last month, but I want to tell you what his last book is on. He, from his perch, watching over many decades since he retired, has focused on moral disengagement. And so he focused on climate change and really saw that part of what we're fighting, what we need to attend to, the force of collective group efficacy against the moral disengagement of other groups, particularly businesses, the culture that we have. So I find comfort in this idea that we as a field together can have a moonshot. And it doesn't mean that we need to go extract from the moon or try to make a better, hospitable place to live, which is obviously not going to happen. So we are the generation who lives in this influential time. And what we do in the next 5 and 10 years matters a lot. And so I would love to be discussing how we're going to go through this portal together. What will you do personally? Of course, it's a very personal decision. And it could be in your personal life, it could be in your work, but I want to talk about what we'll do together. And there are many exciting movements in our field. So ABMR, this small group of behavioral medicine senior researchers, we are now part of FABS, which Roxy Silver's the president of, which is the Federation of Bio and Behavioral Science. I'm sure I got that wrong, but it's a federation that lobbies in DC. And there is a lot of money that's going to be spent on research in the very near future. And so representing behavioral and social research is going to be extremely critical. So FABS is one way that we have collective efficacy. Another is the Behavioral Medicine Research Council, which was really the brainchild of Ken Friedland, who will be getting the Service Award very soon. And that's yet another way we have a collective voice. So with that, I will enjoy our discussions of our collective moonshot and begin the conference and welcome in Terry Moffat. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so it is such a pleasure to introduce Terry Moffat. I'm kind of waiting for her face to appear. This is our first test, right? How this goes.
I can't start my own video. It says that it's under your control. Elissa, can you hear me?
Hey, Elissa.
Yes.
While we're waiting on Terry, some folks have come in since you talked about people claiming a spot, so you might want to mention that again, so folks know.
About masks?
No, about claiming a spot and a blanket.
Okay.